cooperated in that it provided the best access to rocks that could be tied through things like boulder tracks to bedrock units exposed on the upper reaches of the adjacent massifs. In addition to that, we had the unprecedented find of iron soil at Station 4, which turned out to be an example of a lunar volcanic eruption. In addition, there were a number of new geologic tools which allowed more samples to be collected with very minimal hits to the timeline by simply scooping dirt off the lunar roving vehicle while you're driving around. There were a few operational glitches, as on Apollo 15, the lunar roving vehicle fender failed, and that ended up showering both the crew members and the lunar roving vehicle with dirt from the lunar surface. However, the ground got together and basically built, through photographs, clamps, and good old-fashioned duct tape, a new fender which proved its value. So I want to talk a little bit about why Apollo matters. You know, we look back on Apollo with a certain amount of nostalgia, but we don't always think about why Apollo was so important. The first critical thing about Apollo was it taught us that the moon is not simply a big dust ball collected up from the remnants of the solar system formation. Prior to Apollo, we thought that the moon was essentially a big dust ball, and that processes both on the moon and by implication the Earth were essentially, through most of geologic history, quiescent. The reality is we discovered that from the Apollo samples that the formation of the moon was incredibly violent, involving massive impacts and essentially melting of the moon itself down to several hundred kilometers, something that prior to Apollo wasn't even considered possible. And in addition, the implication was if it happened to the moon, it happened to Earth. Essentially, as we have gone through the solar system with spacecraft since Apollo, Mars to the outer planet satellites to even places like Mercury and Venus, it has showed us that the history of the moon is the history of the solar system. So in large part, it's not too far to say that our entire understanding of the history of the solar system and the processes extant has completely changed as a result of the Apollo samples. The second critical part about Apollo that I think really matters is that we learned how to build robust spacecraft that could successfully complete a nominal mission and also could respond to contingencies in a way to bring their crews home safely. Apollo spacecraft had few single-point failures and dead ends that would affect negatively crew survival and mission accomplishment. Apollo 13 has often been described as a successful failure in that the scenario was something that had never really been practiced, and we had to make up as we went, but nevertheless successfully brought the crew home. The other accomplishments that I think are critical is the Apollo 12 landing within 13 meters of its designated point showed that you can land on planetary surfaces from orbit, and it's not just simply a matter of guessing where you land, that you could control a landing to a specific spot. In addition to that, the ability of the lunar module to accommodate an increase in lunar surface time and delivered mass to the surface was critical. The third reason why Apollo matters is that we learned how to do successful manned spaceflight. Prior to Apollo and the commitment to do Apollo, we really didn't know how to do what we do routinely now. The whole complement of forward control rooms, back rooms, mission support rooms, controllers, everything that we know now about how to do spaceflight grew out of Apollo. And without that, doing shuttle, doing space station would have been impossible. The fourth reason why Apollo matters is that we learned to build very large boosters, culminating in the Saturn V. The Saturn V could deliver to orbit the equivalent mass of the Atlas and Mercury spacecraft that we'd been flying to orbit only 6 years earlier. Without large boosters, shuttle would have never happened, we would have never built space station, and we certainly would have never done Apollo. The fifth reason why Apollo matters is that we learned how to do scientific exploration of a planetary surface with humans. This went from pressure garments that enabled the crew to get safely outside their spacecraft, portable life support systems that enable us to get well away from a landed spacecraft, rovers that could transport the crew to significant distances, up to almost 10 kilometers on Apollo 17 and potentially farther, and scientific instrument packages that could be installed on a surface and run reliably for years. So there is some sense in some scientific communities that I consider to be both ignorant and arrogant that little science was produced from Apollo. But as I alluded to earlier, nothing could be further from the truth. Everything we now know about the history of the solar system came from Apollo, and we got that information because we had crew members that could do the scientific investigation process. So there are a lot of lessons from Apollo for future exploration, but in my opinion, there's a number of really key ones. The first thing is that things break despite your best designs and plans. You should expect things that will break, train your crew members how to fix them, and fly your mission. The second is there's never enough time to do everything and see everything. So make a plan and stick to it. But don't get so hung up on the plan that when you find something new, like the orange soil on Apollo 17, you can't respond to it. The third thing is that the judgment of the crew on the surface is really better informed than the folks on the ground. And we should always listen to the people that are there when we're taking into account what's going on. The fourth thing is that navigation capability on the ground is a critical need. It's very easy not so much to get lost on the moon, but not really know how far you need to go and exactly the direction you need to go. And having navigational capability is critical. The fifth thing is that we need the proper tools and the proper procedures for the right situation. If you're taking a soil sample, you need to have the right tool to take a soil sample. Likewise, taking a rock sample. The sixth thing is you want to maximize crew flexibility. We send people to planets because their intellectual capabilities allow them to understand what's going on the fly. This is something robots can't do, and we need to always keep that in mind and maximize that flexibility. The seventh thing is when we have science station deploys, we should automate them as much as possible. Essentially, every Apollo crew who put the LSEP together grumble about how hard it was and that the fact that it took up a whole EVA. If we can automate that in the future, we should. However, anytime you automate something, go back to rule number one. Things break, and you should leave room for crew intervention, regardless of whether it's supposed to be automatically. The eighth thing is that you've got to keep your eyes open for unexpectedly useful things. A prime example is on Apollo 16, the crew executed right after landing something that was called the stand-up EVA, where Dave Scott opened the top hatch of the LEM and basically looked around from that high vantage point and developed his sense of what the landing site was like. That wasn't originally in the flight plan for 16. It was an idea Dave came up with, and it's the kind of thing we need to keep our eyes on. The last thing is that lunar dirt will be a pain, but it is not magical. It's not pixie dust. And there are solutions that can be found to mitigate its problems on the lunar surface when we go back, and we need to be constantly thinking of them. I'll finish this lecture by returning back to the quote from Charles Murray and Catherine Cox that Kennedy's Apollo was a pile of chips pushed to the center of the table. The things that drove Apollo, the time spent, the innovation, the creativity, the pressure, all pushed back to that center goal that Kennedy put out there. And it led to us doing the best work I think this country has ever done. And we should keep that in mind when we go back to the moon.
This is a remarkable place to me because you have on one side over here modern science. This is the new world. And that is primitive the way it was thousands of years ago. This has not been touched.
Well, indeed, It is old Florida, and it's old Florida preserved, which is unique. It's an exceptional place.
It is just awesome to be able to come over the bridge at sunrise onto Merritt Island and into this refuge. And the greenery, the flora and fauna, the wildlife, it's spectacular.
On a narrow stretch of Barrier Island along Florida's eastern shore is an oasis. Here at the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, marshes and scrubland are broken only by towering lawn structures, and birds share the skies with rockets.
2, 1, and liftoff. The Atlas V.
Bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Indian River Lagoon to the west, the refuge shares boundaries with NASA's Kennedy Space Center. To the north lies the unspoiled beauty of the Canaveral National Seashore. Within these borders, a variety of natural habitats provide sanctuary to more than 500 animal species, including 14 that are considered endangered or threatened. The stories of the Wildlife Refuge and the space program have been inseparably linked since the refuge was established in 1960.